Hi there. In this video, we'll be talking about the politics of expansion, which is to say how Americans responded to the growth of their nation between, say, 1815 and 1850 or so, 1840 or so. And not just the growth of their nation, but the growth of their nation's economy. I might add that it might make sense for you to go and watch the party politics video first. It's not a huge deal, but it might make your life a little bit easier. Now, historians used to talk about the time period between 1815 or 1820 and then 1850 or so, largely in terms of a referendum on one person, Andrew Jackson, who was president from 1828 to 1836. Their conversations tended to follow about the same lines they followed when Jackson was still alive, asking whether or not Jackson was aggregating too much power to himself. Now, this is still a potentially interesting question, but it falls down a bit on the question of how much power is too much. The answer to that question depends, as it did in the 1830s, essentially on your politics and not on evidence. However, if you want to get into the effects of or reasons why government might or might not perform certain functions, or other things that help us understand the values, politics, or society and culture in Jacksonian America, run with it. Now, instead of asking the old question of presidential overreach, historians in the past 30 years or so have looked at this period through a different overarching lens, that of what they call the market revolution. Now, what is the market revolution, you ask? I can tell you're asking. That's why I'm going to answer it now. Well, the market revolution is an idea that you can sort of see if you look at this highly romanticized, not at all geographically accurate painting. Now, for a long time, the vast majority of Americans lived lives that were essentially unconnected to outside economic forces. That is, most of them were subsistence farmers. That means they grew up on farms, they made most of what they needed, and traded with their neighbors for anything else they might want. They typically didn't use money in these trades, by the way. They would barter, say, a bunch of flax for some cotton. So if you look at this little picture, maybe imagine a house off in the distance back here, perhaps a few houses next to each other, but largely separated from anything else nearby. Now, in the early 1800s, earlier for some people, later for others, Americans started becoming connected to each other and to outside economic forces, what historians refer to as the market, in new ways. They started, for one thing, using money. They started, for another thing, riding on and transporting their goods on trains, which of course cost money. You don't get on a train bartering flax. They started buying goods made in cities dozens or even hundreds of miles away. And they started putting their money in banks. You can see the changes taking place here in this picture. This train is moving through. Wagons are carrying goods further as well. Certainly one of these buildings has to be a store, and that store is probably connected to some sort of bank or loan, which would allow the storekeeper to purchase goods and set up his wares. And all of that suggests that it was getting harder and harder to make your way completely alone in America. The isolated farmhouse, which we imagined out here, was becoming much more a thing of the past. So with the idea of the market revolution as sort of an organizer, historians have been able to take a new look at why people acted and, this is significant, voted the way they did. This idea of all this new connectedness meant new opportunities, but it also meant new pressures and new threats. So you'll dig deeper into this in your reading, but I'd like you to look at two different things here. I would add, by the way, that historians in the last 10 or 15 years have really started questioning whether or not we've oversold this narrative, whether the changes were as great and all-encompassing as they had previously seemed to be, and whether or not people were actually responding to forces other than the market revolution. So that's something to keep in mind as we go. This image of one of the Lowell Mills, Lowell, Massachusetts, it's now just a suburb of Boston, but it used to be sort of a rural area in which a number of mills were put up to make fabric and things like that. This image offers a very positive view of the changes taking place in this market revolution. So sure, these people no longer lived on their family farms, but in coming to the mills, they appear to be entering a world of happy, easygoing civilization. I love this picture. You can see gentlemen and ladies strolling happily amongst each other. You can see little kids here playing, and everyone seems pretty happy. There's lots of trees. The factories are putting out smoke, but they're clean, they're well organized. This is, of course, propaganda, and I assume and hope you'll consider the extent to which it did or did not capture the reality of the market revolution. This image of the Panic of 1837, on the other hand, which was caused, ironically, most historians believe, by Jackson's vetoing of the National Bank, suggests how being connected to the market might actually hurt people. Well, suddenly, if the stock market crashed, it didn't just hurt bankers and wealthy people who had their money invested in the banks. Instead, it hurt a whole web of people who hadn't previously been wrapped up in the market, but now were. In this image up front, we see how everyday people have been hurt by economic forces over which they had little control and sent into poverty or anger. You see people begging down here. If you look closer at this image, you can actually see that put out more clearly. If you look down here, you can see a pawnbroker's shop with a big line out the window. And similarly, I love this in particular, this crowd right here is outside what is called a mechanics bank. So that is a bank that was set up to help poor mechanics and workers and sturdy industrial laborers. But if you look at it, they're making a run on the bank. The bank is run out of money, and these people are trying to get every bit of money they can get out before they lose it all. So this, at least, is the dominant narrative. Let's bring this back. Ooh, there we are. Very exciting. As I say, some historians have claimed that we've oversold that narrative, that it didn't actually stress people out, as historians had claimed, nor did it feel as new as historians have said. So as you think about the documents you read, see if we're making a mountain out of a molehill, or think about, particularly, if other factors were more influential in changing how people behaved. Now, regardless, all of this focus on the market revolution has led to a reevaluation of why people might have voted for or against Andrew Jackson or his and his successors' opponents in the first place. Historians have noticed that the market revolution coincided with one of the great periods of democratic fervor in American history, when Americans, according to the traditional narrative, started to care more about politics than they ever had before. It is certainly true that Americans started to vote in numbers the like of which had never been seen before on this continent. And not only were they voting in bigger numbers, but as you can see in this sort of adorable image, they were starting to take politics personally in ways that they hadn't done before. Candidates in this party system were starting to encourage people to get out the vote in exciting ways. So Americans who didn't really have television or radio or iPads would find their entertainment sometimes in parades and songbooks and torchlit processions for candidates. For the presidential candidate William Henry Harrison, for instance, who was famously, and I should add supposedly, a resident of a log cabin, the Whig Party in 1840 got out all manner of new electioneering tactics, including cabin raisings in honor of Harrison's log cabin, at which not only would townsfolk get together and raise a cabin, but they would also drink copious amounts of hard cider. So one theory that historians have suggested is that all of these market changes really galvanized voters. Essentially, if you were pro-Jackson, as the theory goes, you had at least a vague fear of the market. I love this. Here's Andrew Jackson, and he's vetoing the bank bill, and he's running off bankers. Here is the chief banker of the U.S. His name is Nicholas Biddle, and as you can tell, he's depicted as Satan. He's got the horns, and he's even got the cloven hooves, and he's running off, desperately afraid of Jackson, who's sticking it to the bankers. So if you were for Jackson, you were wary about the market. If you were voting for the Democratic Party at the time, you were supposed to be a little afraid of all of these changes. Whereas if you were anti-Jackson during this period, that usually meant you were a Whig. You had at least a vague sense that the market could be used for good. Yet even this has raised questions. As I have mentioned, some historians have argued that these politics did not truly engage Americans as much as the market revolution narrative says they did, and rather that people came out to vote not because they cared about politics, but because they were pressured into caring by peer pressure or other incentives, or perhaps simply because they were bored. Does it matter if you vote only because there's nothing else going on in your little Indiana town, and so you may as well come out and drink some hard cider and sing some songs? So even the most basic contentions here are arguable, and I would say that is one of the reasons I find this period so fun to study.